This is IBM Museum. So on this video, I want to show an alternative to something I do on a fairly common basis is to capture the BIOS images of PS2s and other systems. Um, I normally go through and use my EEPROM programmer, and I've demonstrated this on video before. This TL866 2 Plus is the unit I have, and this is a generic Chinese EEPROM programmer that attaches via USB. I really kind of like it. The a lot of the time, the main downside I experience is that they update the supported chips on this fairly commonly, and it'll nag you about an update as possible. And if you skip too many updates, actually the software will refuse to run until you get the updated application and files and install those on the system. But that's easy enough to do. I just go through and I have the program loaded on a lot of my systems with USB, so I can read from different areas, and pretty good all-around device. It does have support for a lot of the chips that can be read out there. And I'm in front of the L40SX, and I'll open this up just to kind of show the insides of it. And I have the camcorder actually focused on the unit as well. I've got it powered up. I just want to be careful that it doesn't go through and go into kind of a suspend condition. That's easily enough to get out. You can actually hear it power down the hard drive. And a lot of this video I may be facing away from the camera too, because the L40SX has no ability for an external keyboard. It does have a single connection on the back, which is for a mouse, or even more specifically for the external keypad. And that's a keypad, not a keyboard. That goes through and adds just these numerical keys, just like you'd have a numpad, so you could go through and place this off to the right-hand side of your keyboard and be able to go through and do the keypad entry. And then on the back, it does have the connection for a mouse. And the L40SX even had a convertible mouse and keyboard that it would go through, and you could run it as a trackball or a mouse. And it's a interesting thing. I can provide a link to the page. It kind of shows it. I do have one around. I just haven't located it as of yet. Now, in this case, I don't need that external keypad. I will be moving the keyboard just to show where that, and the latches are undone on the underside of this. This keypad just kind of spins out in a way like this. We can put it up here. I've actually noticed that the hard drive has spun down. I've had it up and running long enough. And normally you can set that timeout period. I think in my case, I've got it set for like 5 minutes. And that's using the utility called PS2 that's on the reference diskette. Notice I say reference diskette for the Model 40SX, even though it's an ISA unit. IBM did call the diskette a reference diskette instead of a starter diskette for this model. And I've got this unit actually fairly upgraded. I've got some SIMs in there and numeric coprocessor. But what we are interested in particular, I can kind of go through and want to see what my field of vision is. that will go through. Let me pause the video and actually get up the camcorder screen that I have just to kind of focus in. And I'm looking at that center section of underneath this keyboard. Okay, to even get the keyboard a little bit further out of the way to show, and as I say, I'm looking at that center section, and this is just the camcorder coming in from the side, showing the BIOS chip that's on the L40SX, and I can probably turn the webcam back on just to kind of zoom out again. So what I would do when I read the BIOS a lot of time is I go through and extract the chips from the chip or chips from the planar, and I use my EEPROM reader. And for the L40SX, that means going through with the extractor here and cornering in to pull the chip. This is it's a revision 03 that's in there on this working unit. And then here is the 32-pin PLCC chip that I would have to go through and plug into the adapter for my EEPROM reader. Go through, once the chip is in there, going through and making sure I get all the right direction, pin 1 orientation, everything else of this assembly latched in there. And then, pull up the program, have the EEPROM programmer plugged in to be able to read that chip. Then after I'm finished pulling the chip back out, reseeing it in the unit. Just a very involved process. It's delicate work. For the L40SX, I even made the comment that that there is there's kind of an obstruction right off here to the side of that BIOS chip, and that's just a plastic flange that comes up through an opening in the PCB, the printed circuit board, for support. Probably of likely support of that keyboard tray being in place over the top of it, just so as you're going through and typing that keyboard is not flexing a whole bunch or anything like that. And so I'm saying getting the cables out of the way. I can show that. And so that plastic piece, it just really, it goes through and interferes getting that puller. You can kind of see the base of it, and as you go through, of course my focus is off, getting it aligned in the right place. But that's got quite a few pieces at the bottom of it that can get in the way of that plastic flange, can get in the way and makes it a little bit more of a challenge. So the very delicate work just has a lot of interference. So if you have the L40SX working, and let me go through, I want to get over to where, zoom in on the keyboard there. Let's get back to the screen. And of course the hard drive is powered down, the screen is still on. I wanted to go through and show a little bit of the files. Okay. And then, so I've got a couple batch files that I've composed for this. I'm going to go through and I'm going to move that webcam out of the way. I know I'm not facing the screen or anything like that. Just have to kind of see what I'm up on the screen. Of course, you guys get to see my backside. So these are the autoexec.bat was there, but I've created the other 3 batch files. Even that combined.bat is a compiles all the images once I'm through. The dump BIOS is the same batch file, but it's got where it runs the DOS debug program. This is a way to go through and to get that same BIOS image from an operational system. And so let me do a directory of also of the bin images here. Now, I only have this one file on there for because that's me going through that involved process of reading that EEPROM chip that's installed in the unit in my EEPROM programmer. And I go through and I've used the file name convention of that external FRU that IBM put on the label on the chip. That 95F6766 is the FRU, the field replaceable unit or field replacement unit notation for that EEPROM image. You could go through and you could order that from IBM probably at some level, or you knew that that was a particular revision of BIOS for this machine. And so I went through that long process and delicate process of getting that image. In this case, I've just basically copied that back onto the system, put it on the hard drive for a later process that I'm going to demonstrate with this. So the but I'm just showing it's the only bin file that I have in the directory right now, and I'm just in the root directory of the hard drive. And so I want to go through and I'll of course this is not case sensitive at all, but this is the contents of that the dump BIOS batch file. And so I'm going through and the first line is I'm with debug. I'm using the DOS debug program. You know, that's included with DOS for time innumerable now. And it hasn't varied through the DOS versions really all that much. I'm going through it and I'm piping through a particular script file that I've composed. That's what that arrow symbol pointing towards the debug does, is that's piping in the script file I have. And by convention, I name those SCR, even though on the computer those can be confused with the screensaver programs. And the screensaver is actually just an executable program the same way. You write the program that it displays what the screensaver does, and then you rename it as SCR. But for all intents and purposes, that screensaver program, you know, you can rename that extension and even run the program to do a preview or whatever of the screensaver. But the screensaver program, and we'll get back to the later commands I run in this batch file as well. But let's do the same thing of a type and we're going to do this dump BIOS .script, and let's actually do I think I'll need to do a more command because it is a little bit of information. So this script file, when it's run through debug, it goes through and I'm just the end command is I'm providing the name of the file and extension that I want out of it. I'm going through and I'm plugging in values into the BX and CX register as far as the size of the memory contents I want to read. And basically that's that 8,000 hex is 32 KB of that ROM image, or a memory size, 32 KB. And I'm doing this in 4 sections and reading the range of in the E and the F segments, just half at a time, and writing it to that file by that name. And as I go through and I cover both the E and the F segments, and then lastly that separate Q on a line by itself goes through and quits the DOS debug program. So let's go through and show the batch file again. .bat. Okay, so after debug completes, then I'm going through and copying those files and basically combining those into larger images of those bin files. I'm going through and combining 2 files into a file name for the E segment BIOS, the 2 halves of the F segment BIOS into a single file, and then even combining that E and F segment into one complete file that I'm naming the L40 BIOS 3 for being revision 3.bin. And I could go through and I could rename that L40 BIOS 3, you know, the FRU of the BIOS. But you know, that's the name I've selected. I've selected that for a reason in this instance, because I want to do a file comparison at the end, just as a way of confirming that all the script file and all this combination of the files comes up with the same image if I'd taken that, extracted that BIOS chip out of the system and read it externally in my EEPROM reader. So the combined bat, that does this, it's a batch file, does the same thing, only without running the debug portion. That would be for just that file compilation or building thing of the end of that dump BIOS.bat. And I came up with combined BIOS bat first. And I thought, well, why don't I just run it all from a batch file? And then lastly, the compare batch file just uses what's called the FC command in DOS, or FC utility in DOS, the file compare, and I'm doing a binary comparison with that /B. The /C means that it's not case sensitive. You could have a BIOS that has that the letters say basically the same thing, whether they're lowercase or uppercase, and that wouldn't matter for my comparison. And I have that batch file set up to do the comparison. You don't have to have it in a batch file. Of course, you could do this at the command line. And I'll use this as a final step. I'm comparing the version that I got in my EEPROM reader to what I'll compile through this software process. And we'll run the compare.bat at the end of this just to kind of show that everything is all the same. I've gone through and verified that this process works. Now on the PS2s, they differed a little bit from the earlier PC line, that ROM BIOS covered what was called the F segment in memory space, and it was just that 64 KB section of the memory space that could all fit into. As far as the code that the system ran when it first started up, and the PS2s are different in that it has IBM added the A BIOS, the advanced BIOS, and the old area of the BIOS, that F segment, is considered the C BIOS area, the compatibility BIOS area, to be compatible with the older way of doing things, the DOS area basically. That A BIOS was for the purposes of more advanced operating systems such as OS2. That IBM came out with OS2 interfaces to that A BIOS area, and for that the space that the BIOS was in the memory space is also uses the E segment as well. And we've seen that with that dump BIOS script. I'm going through and I'm dumping both the E segment and the F segment into files and then combine them both, and I'm coming up with ultimately a 128 KB file for both the E and the F segments, being 64 KB themselves. So let's go through and we're going to run the just as a last confirmation, we'll go through. I'm running this in real time. That's the only bin file I have right now. So let's go through and run the dump BIOS batch file. I don't have to give it the file extension. It's going to run that batch file. Okay, it runs through that debug script and then does the final sections of copying those files. And probably the extra lines at the bottom is I've got basically line feeds within that batch file, and I'm going through and having that come up on the screen. I'm not going through and hiding or suppressing the screen display as it runs through that batch file through something like an echo off command. So going through and looking at things now, using the wildcard character of just any bin file in that root directory, that is what we have now. We've got the 4 files at the top of that of the memory space that they cover, from E000 to E7FF in hex, being that first half of the E segment, E800 through EFFF being the second half of that E segment, and the same thing for the F segment, the first and second half of that. And I'm just breaking it into smaller pieces, not necessarily just as a way to isolate it down closer. I could even break it into smaller segments. That's just how I preferred to have it set up. And each one of those halves of the E and F segment are that 32 KB. And then going through and copying the files into the E segment BIOS and F segment BIOS.bin files separately. The E segment BIOS.bin is 64 KB. F segment BIOS.bin is 64 KB. And then those are combined into that L40 BIOS3.bin file. And that's the full 128 KB of both that E and F segment together. And you notice the file size is the same as that only bin file I had previously of the 95F6766 bin file. Those are the exact same size, and that's critical for the file comparison. You can see that by the timing of the time of those files, I created that or copied over that file at 3:29, just right before 3:30 this afternoon. I've just run the other the times of the other files are just what we ran minutes ago, 5:17 p.m. So next I want to do the compare batch file, and I don't have to put anything after it. I've gone through within the batch file. In fact, let's do this. Let's type it out again. Okay, so that's set to compare the file from earlier that I had through my EEPROM reader to the file that was composed by combining those 4 different segments, and then they're compiled into 2 segments and then compiled to one big file. So if I do just the compare batch file, it goes through and compares them, and there is no differences encountered in that, and that's a good sign. That means that is gone through for the testing of the both methods against each other, and they have the same result, being that that's the same BIOS version in this case, by both methods that I've used to capture it. So this is a way with an operational system. You could have an operational PS2, and of course you can go through and rename those files that batch file process comes up with. That last little bit, that L40 BIOS 3, being renamed as appropriate for the system that you're running that on. But it's a way for an operational computer that you don't have to go through and have an EEPROM programmer and pull chips and go through that long, delicate process. You can quickly with what's compiled here to just run a program and use the installed DOS debug program that's should be on the system. If you have DOS installed, or a lot of time the PS2s had DOS on them. So this is a way to do that same process through software. And so I hope it's informative. I'll include a link to where I got these script files and batch files. I've got it all zipped up in one big thing. And I've gone through and I've actually got the bin files that I came up with this process. I ran through this process earlier, of course, just as a prep for the video, make sure it runs completely. I've got all those bin files wrapped up in that as well. And even the compare batch file to go through and do the comparison. Just as an example of running it on the L40SX, I wanted that to have the completed image of what I've done on the EEPROM reader to be compared. And of course, I'll give a link as well within that same directory that I have the dump BIOS contents. I also have it's split into subdirectories by the PS2 models that I've gone through, and I've dumped the BIOS of those into those directories. It's a hierarchy. It has a hierarchy of how those directories are composed. And typically within each directory, and I need to go through and really kind of follow up and get it a little bit more organized. A lot of time I'll have a versions.txt file in there. And that just is the written out explanation, basically, of those BIOS versions on the system. What revision they are, what the date of that BIOS is, um, all the details there. And so you know which file of those FRU file name convention I use is basically a newer version. And all it would take, for putting that back in, if you have a PS2 that's got an older BIOS, you could use you'd have to have an EEPROM program, of course, but going through and downloading that image, programming it onto the appropriate chip, and plugging it into the system to have a newer BIOS on that PS2. A lot of the time the PS2s, the initial ones are not going to have any mechanism for a flash BIOS update or any other way than using an EEPROM programmer in those older EEPROM chips to be able to program those for your system. But I'll include links to that. If you enjoyed this video, the process I've gone through, click on that like button, please, and subscribe to my channel, because you'll see lots of content like this in later videos. This is just something that of the last couple days it generated, the thought in my mind that I should do a video on it after coming up with a sequence. I've gone through for the PS2 news group on Facebook, and I'll include a link in the video description for that. That's where all this has transpired, as a way to just as a member there saying, hey, I've got an operational system. I don't have an EEPROM reader, but how do I go through and dump the EEPROM contents or get it into a file so we can get a little bit more analysis of that file and find out what version it is in the system. And his L40SX does have a newer date on the BIOS, different FRU, slightly different FRU. Externally, it's identified as a 95F6768, and internally in the code, it even identifies it as a 95F6767. So it doesn't match any of the FRU and the date I have for what is ultimately revision 3 that I've dumped, but that may be something that may be a regional distribution or some other thing, some other reason why that has a different FRU. Now, IBM did go through in some cases on an identical BIOS, and they had that BIOS report a different BIOS submodel because it would have a difference between a Type 1 and Type 2 planar or something like that. It was the same BIOS, but they wanted to attempt, at least in software, to that you could have a way to tell if that was a Type 1 or Type 2 planar by software. And that was done in the instance of the PS2 Model L40SX to distinguish between a Type 1 and Type 2 planar. That didn't really come out successfully in the end, because IBM had leftover BIOS chips for their Type 1 planar that they just ended up dropping in on the Type 2. And so it was a nice concept, but in implementation, IBM kind of failed and dropped the ball, and really didn't have personnel follow through with what they had intended to do with that process. And the L40SX planar that this individual has in the PS2 Facebook group is a little bit different. It has a different chip. The L40SX, I do have a separate planar that has different component identifiers and really goes through, and it's basically all the same, very close to the same planar. It has the same chips and everything else, but it goes through and reorders those entirely, re-indexes them for their component identification. So it just really throws out having a nice simple diagram of the L40SX planer. And you know, it's just one of those things. This other planer that the individual has, it has a different chip on there on the, and so just trying to see if that different BIOS version maybe is for encompassing that aspect or something else, or whether it's a regional. And he's in the UK, in the United Kingdom, so it may be a regional thing as well. There was differences. The L40SX had different regional keyboards that could be in place and things like that. So it may go through and be something associated with that. But I went through and talked about it, whether you enjoyed the video, to click on the like button or the subscription to my channel. But we've come to where we've got to wrap it up. And that's all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.